Okay, just dealing with one of the challenges that groups are having again. The beauty of MVC is the way it so nicely gives us control over all the code that we actually are working with. One of the things that has been sort of a limitation so far, the way we've done it in most of the tutorials and so on, is very, I'm tempted to call it columnar, right? We have a controller for each entity, and inside each controller, then we have the views for insert, update, delete, and so on and so forth. But we're always doing or focusing on one entity at a time, patient, doctor, whatever, right? But in the real world, the fact is that most of our entities, as we know, have relationships or interact with other entities. So we often need something that's more of like a master detail page. Think of an invoice where you have the order and order details and so on and so forth. Well, that type of interface is actually quite easy to do with the the techniques that we've already learned for controllers and views, just with a slight bit of twist on the situation. So just as we've had fun recently adding things like our cascading drop-down list for regions and so on, and we had our fun adding lookup values and things like that. I just want to get into one more thing then. So I decided to use the patient. Now we've done kind of like this before with our details views where we have then a detail showing, for example, all the patients for a given doctor and so on. But what I did here is I added a few more things, right? So when we go to details for a patient, well, a patient will have many appointments over time and maybe many lab tests, right? So to bring it all together into one view is very, very powerful in terms of the user interface design. And the truth is, this is just doing what we've done before. I'll show you the code in a second, but just to give you the idea of the functionality then. So, here are my appointments. If I want to add a new appointment, I just click add, notes for the appointment, can't sleep at night, right? The date, if I, who maybe it was last Friday they came in, I'm just making the notes now. Extra fee, like if there was, like a $20 fee for a doctor's note or extra things that they aren't covered by OHIP, I'll just leave it as $20. And a optional reason for the appointment. It's really not illness. Maybe we'll call it mental state. I don't know. Add the appointment, right? So that it just shows up immediately. So you can see how this works. Really that's not a mental state issue. So it can just go back and edit and change that back to no reason given, right? And save that change. Okay. And then obviously, actually that was the wrong person. Oh gosh, that was Fred, not Wilma. So I can just delete that, right? Remove it. And there we go. We're back down. So you can see how nicely this interface can work. And you could implement it, same thing for lab tests and so on. Notice I do have the total adding up here. So if we do go back and add something else, a doctor note for missed work. And yep, that was today. But it's the fifth time we're charging them $100 for that. And reason given, we'll call it illness because they were sick, right? There, so you can see how it's adding up the total and so on. So you can see how this kind of the same approach could be used with invoices and things like that. Let's just show more one other aspect. So you can take it as a bit of a wizard approach as well. So if we create a new patient, I'll just fill in some data here. Okay, just a little bit of data. Of course, remember we're just using our standard view here. So we have all of our validation. Everything is there just as we have had it before. Oops, I'm missing a digit there in the OHIP number. And I go to select the doctor. We don't have one. Well, we did this the other day. We'll just create a new doctor here. The new doctor that just joined the practice is Mr. New Doctor, right? And he is in Canada and from Ontario. Okay, so we'll just refresh that, and then now we can select our new doctor, and away we go. But notice I decided to put next on here as opposed to just create, because it's really nothing special. But just after that, we might as well, instead of going back to the list, we might have additional information related to the patient. So we're going to add their first appointment as well, right? So here's the patient, uh, uh, initial uh, what's the word for when you get a checkup, right? Oop, I spelled it wrong, but you don't care. Okay. And the date, there's no extra fee for an initial checkup. And I should probably add another reason, but anyway, I'll just leave it as no reason. And there you go. So you see how this works, right? So it's a bit of a flow. I can always go back to the patient list and see my new patient, right? Go into the details anytime I want, get the entire patient history, all the lab tests and so on that they've had. So let's now look at the code. Now you see the big picture of what we're actually doing. All right. Okay, so the first thing I did then as going to do this is obviously I had to add some more entities, right, in order to make it a bit more complex example to work with. Trouble is we so often just start with things so simply, right? So I added things like the appointment, right, and it has related to it lookup for complaint. Okay, I started off with that. Maybe I changed the way I'm using it to sort of the reason for the appointment. But the complaint, oh, I have a headache, or I'm sick, or I cut my finger off when I was doing renovations in the basement, whatever, right? So it is apparent to the appointment in a one-to-many relationship, right? So we have the foreign key values here and just the data that you saw in there already. No problem. Well, by the way, here's a little bit of a fun thing. If you ever want to set default values, there's many ways to do that. But rather than doing that inside of a view, it's usually best to centralize, right? The dry principle, don't repeat yourself. So centralize defaults. And one of the ways to do it here is in the constructor. So if I create a new appointment, right, I can just set the appointment date to today and the extra fee to a default value quite easily in here. So that was one thing I did. It came in handy later on. I'll show you why. And what else did we add? We added test types, right, as a parent. So, things like blood tests versus urine tests versus x-rays and so on. And then, of course, actual tests themselves, right? So again, we have the foreign key values for the test type. And we also have a foreign key for patient because this is a intersection essentially supporting the many-to-many between test types and patients. And we have a date and some notes as well, right? So we've added these 4 entities, and of course that involved a little bit of work in our DB context, right? Just adding the new DB sets for complaint, appointment, lab test, and so on. And I also decided to do one thing, Cascade Delete. I wanted when you delete a patient, the history of appointments would be deleted, right? So I just thought I'd throw in that little bit of code here using our Fluent API. We've had a quick look at that before, but this is the kind of thing you can easily do to override our default, because remember, we removed the one-to-many Cascade Delete. So that's all we did here. I think I did, of course, added a little bit of data to our seed, right? So coming down here to the seed data, right? Remember we looked the other day, we added our countries and regions first. Okay, and then I'm adding my test type, my lookups, my test types, my complaints, and then we add our doctor and patients. And then because I need the patient first before I can actually create lab tests and appointments, because they relate back to both test type and patient, right? So I have to put these afterwards. So I just seeded a bit of data into each of those. Then we updated the database and away we went. Okay, so that's basically it for that. Let me just close all those documents. All right, so how does it actually work then? Well, we've had this discussion before. There's 2 main approaches. So the first thing I did is I just came in, or the next thing is I came into controllers and I added the 4 controllers, the normal way: appointments, complaints, right? Test types and lab tests. Now, I confess in the posted code, I never touch them. I'm going to leave it to you. You know what you need to do. You need to come in and make the usual changes, add our try-catch blocks for error handling. That's the most important thing. Maybe consolidate things like lookups and so on and so forth. I didn't even touch them. Okay, so obviously you'd eventually want to be able to go in and maintain all of these as well, but that wasn't the focus of this exercise. So to get down to the point, what I did is I said, okay, well, working with a patient, right? Let's come to the patient's controller here. And if I go to the details, okay, that's where we saw most of our master details work was being done, right? So you can do this in one query, by the way. We'll explore that option later on. But I'm just going to get the one patient that we want to get. And then I'm just going to grab into the view bag the collection of appointments and lab tests. you're probably thinking right away, well, gosh, you could just do a dot include, change this to a where instead of find, and do dot include to include the appointments in the lab tests. That's absolutely true. And if you didn't care what order they were in, that would be perfectly acceptable. But usually when you're looking at a master details page like that, you want to see them in a specific order, usually by date if there's a date involved, right? So that's why I did it as a separate set of queries. I know that you're hitting the database more often, but you'd be surprised how little difference that makes performance-wise once you have the context up and available anyway. There are other approaches we can do, and I'll explore those, as I said, later on with you. But in the meantime, we just have our appointments, right? I just wanted it ordered by the date, descending, so the order is consistent with both lab tests and dates. So I just throw those into the view bag as well. Then we return view patient, right? So the rest of the work actually happens in the patient view and then to do with actual appointments. So I didn't take time to do, it's just repeating the exact same process for the lab tests as for appointments. So I just did the one for this example. Let's just have a quick look at the patient details view then. Oh, wrong one. Okay, details, right? So here we go. So what I did as well, we had all these fields. So the first thing I did is I just made a row, right, and divided up the different name value pairs here, just to spread it out across the top of the screen instead of having it all vertical. Now, of course, if you go down to a narrower device, it will shrink down as well. So that just finishes here. So that's basically what would normally be in the details view, just split into two columns, right? Okay. Now, I threw in the little collapse, right, with a little button here, same as we've done before. That's why you reuse the same code. You could play around with the bootstrap if you want a collapsible panel or an accordion control, anything like that, feel free. All right. So now we come down to the actual tables themselves. So for appointments then, right, this is basically right out of the index almost for the appointments. We would just have a table, right, with the different headings. By the way, it's easier in this case usually to just hard code the column headings, and that's perfectly fine. I decided to throw the add link in above the other column where you would normally do your edit and so on. So I have an action link here. Notice we're using the style or the overload for action link that allows us to specify the controller. So this is the link text. Actually, I'll get the help up. The link text followed by the action name. You might say add, why not create? I'll explain that in a second. It essentially is the create of appointment, and I'm passing some parameters. The patient ID, right? The patient full name. I figure why bother? I'm just going to focus on appointments. So why bother going to ask the database for that summary property for the patient? I have it here, so it's easy to pass it as a parameter. That makes it easy to display that at the top of the page in nice big letters for everyone to see without having to go back and look it up yet again. Okay, so and then just I'm using Glyphicon here in the class just to give it that little plus sign. Notice it combines the Glyphicon, the plus sign, with the text that I left here in the action link, right? So that's why we get the plus sign with the word add beside it. Okay, well, that's just the link. All right, then we loop through each and every one of the appointments. So notice I'm just going to my view bag where I loaded the appointments. I put them in the view bag separately from in the model, just so that they could be sorted alphabetically for me already, rather than sorting it in the view or anything like that. Okay. Oh, the other thing is I have to, if I'm going to work with appointment objects, it doesn't have the namespace at the top of the page. It doesn't know about this model in particular, so we just fully qualify the name. You saw the same type of code when we did checkboxes as well, when we want to refer to a model, right? Okay. Excuse me. So then we just loop through all of the appointments, showing the date, the complaint name, the reason why they're there, the extra fee. And here's just a little bit of code then just to keep track, right? So you notice up here, I just defined a variable, total fees, initialize it to 0. It's a decimal. And every time we loop through, we just add the extra fee to the running total, so to speak. And then we have our 2 more action links. Notice I don't have any text there. I'm just going to use the glyphicons for update and remove. Basically edit and delete, right? We'll talk more about why it's that way. And again, I'm passing the full name and the model ID, but of course I also have to pass the actual ID of the appointment that we're going to edit or delete. So that goes along as well. Okay. Just in the last row, then after I'm finished looping through the data, I'm just showing the total, like a summary row at the bottom, total fees, and then just taking it, two-stringing it to currency, and away we go. And that's basically it. Now, you would repeat the whole thing for the lab test. As I said, I'm going to leave it to you to do the code. It's just repeating the exact same approach that I have up here. So why does it say appointment and not appointments and add, update, and remove? Well, I could, right? We could have come into the appointments controller, which we generated. And as I said, I haven't touched it. It's all the standard scaffolded code. And we could use the create, edit, delete, and so on. And that works, right? But we find ourselves putting a lot of if structures. Similar to our discussion the other day, I'd have to put in, well, I'm kind of using create. Am I creating this appointment just because I want to, from the appointments controller, maintain all the appointments? Or am I doing it specifically for a predefined or pre-chosen patient that I'm adding the appointment for? So sometimes it's cleaner, right? What I did is I right-clicked in controllers. I right-clicked, add controller. And this is how I got started. So a standard controller for our appointment. Okay. Now we already I created the standard one for appointments, right? So I just changed the name slightly. I took out the S. I mean, I could have maybe, in hindsight, maybe should have said patient appointments or something like that. But anyway, I made basically another copy of the controller, right? That's how I got this appointment controller in place. But just to point out, all we have in here, okay, I've taken out details, right? Because we don't even use it. And the index, I didn't want to remove it because, the mapping, right? But it'll always look for index as a default value. But basically, the purpose of this controller and the views that are the child views of this controller is to maintain appointments only for a given patient, right? So if you came to index, well, that's useless because there'd only be one for the one patient, right? So I would just redirect back you to the general controller and views for maintaining all the appointments in the system. Okay. And, I just find sometimes when you're working with multiple controllers, especially if ones we're all dealing with the same model object, appointment, right? If you have going back and forth between them and you have create method here and create method there and so on between them, it's easily confused. So I like to, in a situation like this, use variations of the name. So add is basically create, update is edit, and remove is delete, right? But these are, and I started with the actual code from the appointments controller, the scaffolded code, right, for create and so on. So I took it first and then modified it, right? Oops, sorry. Appointment, it's got pinned over here. Let me just clean this up a bit. Okay. And of course, with this different approach, because we're always working with an existing patient here or planning or with a specified patient that we're adding an appointment for, I can pass in a patient ID, right? Because we come here from that details view for the patient. So you saw that we added these parameters, the patient name, the full name, and the patient ID. So I throw the full name into the view bag so I can display it easily on my create, I should say my add view. And I'm taking this approach, I'm creating the appointment object because, hey, I know the patient already. Remember, you can't do this unless you assign a value to patient ID because it doesn't take null values, right? But I can do it here because I know the patient, and that way I get the advantage of all those other defaults that I defined in the constructor for an appointment, right? The date being today's date and the extra fee being the default value of 20 and so on. Okay, so I created a brand new appointment object, okay, assigning the patient for the patient we have. Call my populate drop-down list. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And I return the view passing this appointment object as the model, right? Okay, so maybe we'll follow it through that way. So we'll go to the actual add. So if I come down here, right, it generated these. I just changed the names. Notice that I've deleted completely the index, okay, and the details because I never will need them because this is maintaining appointment for one and only one patient. So let's come to the add. So here I'm just making good use with a nice big header at the top of the patient name, add appointment for such and such, right? In the hidden inputs, okay, I'm going to store the patient ID. Like normally we would have a drop-down list where you'd select it. Well, if you notice down in the code, I've just deleted the div completely. that would have the drop-down list, because I'll never need to select a patient. I'm only doing this for appointments for a pre-selected patient. And storing the patient name just again, so I'm carrying it around instead of having to go back to the database to find it out again. Now the rest of the code is pretty much the standard one that would have been generated automatically, just modifying a little bit, the prompt or the label for the complaint ID drop-down list. And because it does allow null, I'm just saying no reason given, because we can select no reason, right? And that's basically it. Down at the bottom, my action link there, instead of going back to the list, right? Well, there is no such thing for an individual, the appointments for an individual patient. I just go back to the patient details, right? Returning the patient ID from the model, and away we go. So if I decide to cancel this and just go back, I go back to the details view that I came from to get over here. You see how that works nicely, right? Back in the controller. So if I have finished adding, right, then I come to the post for add, right? Don't forget to include all of your extra properties here. And I also need the patient name, that string, just so I can keep maintaining it back and forth if I have to go back and display validation errors and so on and so forth. So I try to add the appointment, save changes, but if I do, notice this will be different. I'm going to redirect once more back to patient details, right? So I'll just redisplay, and I don't have to worry about refreshing because this will just bring up a refreshed copy of the patient details. If we've added the appointment, it'll just be there in the list. Bada bing. Try catch just for any possible database error. And I didn't add anything in particular, so that's why my try catch is pretty straightforward. Just saving the patient name in case we still need it later on. Populate drop-down lists, and away we go. Now, actually, you might have noticed in the main controller, populate drop-down list. Let me just jump there for a second and go to definition. I took the approach first of building my select list, right? That gets returned from one method, and then I use that method here. In the actual appointments, you have to have drop-down lists for both the complaint ID, right, the reason for the appointment, and for the patient. But we never need to pick a patient, so I figured why bother building all that, right? We'll never need it, so we don't do it. Okay, so it's almost the exact same approach then for update, right? Okay, we get the patient ID, the patient name, and of course the ID of the appointment itself that we're modifying, right? And we do the same type of thing in the update. Of course, we're going to use our try update model approach. Okay, but if we successfully save changes, we just go back to the patient details once again to review the information for this one and only patient. So, and delete is the same approach. So you can follow the code yourself. It's pretty straightforward. The main thing that might be strange is why are these in a separate controller, right? Appointment controller as opposed to the general appointments for maintaining all the appointments in the system. Remember, this is the one where you'd probably go in and in the index add some filters and sorting and so on, so you could filter, see all the appointments that have been related to accidents and things like that for filter by complaints and so on and so forth. But that's good enough. So anyway, if you like how this works, I think that you'll find it's pretty easy to replicate on your own. It certainly is possible to go in and, pardon me, just reuse the same controller and views, but you just end up putting all these if structures everywhere in both the views and the controller. So it's cleaner to separate it out sometimes, and that's where I would prefer to do something like this myself. So if I come in, somebody else just to show you. Okay, so we have a few here, a test one. Obviously, I was playing around. You'll find some garbage in my database, but very quickly we can just, excuse me, go in, edit, flu with a fever, right? Extra fee, nothing, and away we go. I just fixed that little error I had there. So you can do the exact same implementation for lab tests, maintain them as well. But I've said that already. I'm going to shut up and shut off the recording.